to take your questions whenever they occur. All right, everybody, nice to be back with you today. And I've got a lot to cover, so I am going to jump back in. I just want to point out to you briefly what we started speaking about, which is, of course, that we actually just recorded the worst day in terms of new positive coronavirus tests. Please note that the death rate is not nearly as high as it had been in the past. And so this is not uniformly bad news, although the death rate does tend to lag behind the positive test rate. So we'll see in a couple of weeks. Let's hope medical advances mean that this will not be as lethal as it was a month or 6 weeks ago. But I do think what is absolutely clear is that we are not out of the woods, and that vigilance, both personal, individual, with our friends, with our family, but also socially, that we need to recognize that the only way we're going to contain this until there's a vaccine or effective treatment is by being absolutely careful. Right now we have non-pharmacological as opposed to pharmacological, non-medicinal as opposed to medicinal. We have to wear masks. We have to wash our hands. We have to maintain our distance. We have to be careful. And it's tempting, of course, to want to resume life as normal, but it is not safe. It's not safe for us. It's not safe for others. And so we have to continue to maintain our vigilance. I would point out also that we got new unemployment numbers, and they're actually up a little bit. And it appears now that the real unemployment rate must be pretty close to 20%. The official unemployment rate is closer to 15%. But that's almost certainly a quite substantial undercount. As you may have seen, the International Monetary Fund decreased its growth estimate for the globe by almost 5% in the last couple of days. And so we are in the middle of a major global economic contraction, in addition to being in the middle of a major global pandemic. And of course, in ways that I'll describe to you in just a minute, we're continuing to see protests in the street around, in particular, police violence in particular against African Americans, and the slow pace of legislative change to address it. Now, I'll say more about that in a minute. But Immanuel, the former chief of staff for Barack Obama in his first term, says we have a coincidence of crises right now. We have a once every 100-year pandemic, a once every 75-year economic contraction, and at the same time, a once every 50-year civil uprising. And I think that's a very good way to describe the peculiar convergence in politics at our historical moment. And I think one of the things we will have to see, obviously, we're also in the middle of a presidential election. And it's not very often in American history that an incumbent loses their office. But it does appear that this president, if the polling that we're seeing right now, may in fact be in trouble in the polls. And so how does this convergence of crises, what's increasingly seeming to amount to a more systematic crisis, play out in the politics of an election year, I think is a very important question. And of course, underlying all this, and the topic for these lectures we've been working on for quite a while now, is the question of inequality. And I think one of the things that we're beginning to really get a strong sense for is how many different forms inequality takes. Inequality can be inequality in income or wealth or access to healthcare or treatment by the police and the criminal justice system. And so inequality can have material economic effects, but it can also have psychological effects, sociological effects. It can get under your skin and inside your head, increase the prevalence of suicide, decrease social health overall. And so I hope at this point in the course, we've got a good grasp on the complexity of inequality, both the multiple dimensions or metrics of inequality and the diverse but almost all debilitating effects that it has. So having said that, let me get more firmly into the lecture. And I want to start with a little bit of current information. And so I'm going to be transitioning into a normative perspective, a philosophical perspective, a perspective in which we attempt to ground our intuitions about inequality being objectionable, about all human beings being fundamentally morally equal and deserving, therefore, of equal concern and respect. We will get into that. But just for a moment, I wanted to just circle back to the protests that we talked about in the last couple of weeks. And this is a diagram of states that have adopted reform so far. And I would note to you that Minnesota, right, square in the middle at the top there, is in the pink category, which is to say that bills have been introduced in Minnesota, but as you may know, the special session of the legislature failed to reach any kind of compromise. And it's looking increasingly unlikely that the United States federal legislature is going to be able to legislate on this. There's too much difference between Democrats and Republicans. And so although the headline of this diagram is that many states are revisiting their policing strategies, I would retitle it that there's been limited progress on police reform so far. And if you look, there are exactly 3 states, New York, Iowa, and Colorado, that have had any kind of success in passing a bill, whereas the vast majority of states have either not introduced any bills, don't have their legislature in session, or the bills have been introduced but not passed. And we will see. A state like California, I suspect there will be bills passed. It's just not quite there yet. But in a state like Minnesota, in which the legislature is divided between the 2 parties, I think it's going to be very difficult to get any meaningful reform passed. And this reflects the fact that this remains, despite the outpouring of protests in the streets, a partisan issue. And we begin to see this by asking simple polling questions. Who faces discrimination? Is it African Americans? Well, the majority of Americans say yes, 61%. 3/4 of Democrats say yes, but a minority of Republicans, a growing minority, and I think this is, in a sense, progress if you believe that racial discrimination is real, but it's still only 45% of Republicans who say this. And I'll just let you decipher much of the rest of this on your own, but I will point out to you, and I think this is quite interesting, right? If you ask, do men face discrimination? A rather small share of Democrats say yes. Half as many more Republicans, going up to almost 1 in 5, say men face discrimination in our society. If you ask whether whites face discrimination in our society, again, only around 10% of Democrats, but literally 1 in 4 Republicans say whites face discrimination. So if you compare those 2 numbers, right, more than half the Republicans, half as many Republicans believe that whites face discrimination as believe that blacks face discrimination. Whereas for the Democrats, that figure's more like 1 in 8 as opposed to 1/2. So there are some real discrepancies in public opinion here. On the other hand, if we look at just who groups have unfavorable views of, right? And again, we can see gaps here that are pretty important. Democrats tend to be most critical of evangelicals, and then quite critical of the police, right? And so 45% of Democrats are unfavorable of the police right now, or critical of the police, whereas only 25% of Republicans are, right? And another big gap. And when we go down to the other end of the spectrum, we see that African Americans are criticized by about 1 in 5 Republicans, but only about 1 in 10 Democrats. That Muslims are much more disfavored by Republicans than by Democrats by a ratio of 2 to 1. And similarly, undocumented immigrants, it's only less than a third of Democrats who are unfavorable towards undocumented immigrants, whereas nearly 2/3 of Republicans are unfavorable to them. And I would point out to you, of course, there was this important Supreme Court decision last week allowing the deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA or Dreamers, to remain in the country, overturning or at least staying President Trump's executive order as not being grounded in the appropriate procedures or justifications. Now, here's the one piece of good news in all this data, which is that younger Republicans are much more open to seeing discrimination than older Republicans are. And so what we see is that whereas all Republicans, about 45% of them think that there's discrimination against African Americans, that goes up to over 55% if you divide at age 45. And of course, the older Republicans are much less likely to agree that there's discrimination. And again, you can decipher the data for yourself, but as you see, the younger Republicans are becoming a bit more like the Democrats in their perception of where discrimination occurs in our society. And that may bode for better success in things like police reform going into the future, as well as perhaps indicating that the Trump strategy of essentially relying almost exclusively on white voters is probably not going to work a decade or so from now, not only for demographic reasons, but also due to the changing views of younger Republicans. All right, so I just wanted to bring you up to date on that for a moment. Are there any questions at this point on those materials? All right, then I will continue on with the lecture, and I want to review where we've been. Last week we did kind of an overall refresher lecture, and if you remember, we started looking at just the evidence that America has become a much more unequal society over the last 50 years, and then searching for explanations in the global economy, the move into automation, the move away from manufacturing and into services and information in our economy, and the decline of unions as well as progressive taxation, right? And we then transitioned into thinking about what is it in society that tends to make inequality a recurring problem, come back again and again if it's not actively combated. And we looked a little bit more at the kind of sociological and psychological perspective. We looked at the rising phenomenon of deaths of despair in the United States and the way in which, as the white working class lost union manufacturing jobs, it not only rendered them economically precarious, but also socially marginal. And that the way in which that experience seems to have been quite psychologically damaging for them. And so This accounts then for an increased prevalence of suicides, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, overdoses, and in fact, heart disease related to anxiety. We then also looked at the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, two very influential British epidemiologists who look at inequality as a major contributor to ill health among wealthy societies, and who in fact maintain that inequality predicts overall social health very strongly, whereas wealth no longer predicts it. Once you become a wealthy country, it doesn't matter if you get wealthier or not. As long as you're over that 20,000 per person per year threshold of income, the further increases in wealth seem to contribute nothing to health or well-being or happiness. But the level of inequality in your society strongly influences those measures, to the point where a more unequal society has shorter life expectancies, higher rates of obesity, higher rates of bullying of children, higher rates of infant mortality, et cetera, right? In so many different metrics, living in a more unequal society turns out to be bad for almost everyone. And they explain this by pointing to status anxiety, the fact that in a more unequal society, we know that people are looking at us on a regular basis, and that as they look at us, they are evaluating us, and they're evaluating us relative to each other to see where we fall in that pyramid, in that social hierarchy, and that it's actually stressful to be perpetually evaluated in that way. And the stress that it generates is strongly correlated to both psychological and physical health problems. All right, so that's where we left off. And today I want to start a new topic. It's the second to last topic in this lecture series. And one way to put this is that I'm going to stop being as descriptive as I've been up until this point, in the sense of trying to describe to you how inequality has grown, why it's gotten so much worse over the last 50 years, and what it's doing to us. And instead be more prescriptive. And that is to say, tell us more what we should do about inequality. Stanley has actually been pushing me to do this for a while now, and I'm going to pay my debt to him in the next few lectures. And the way in which I want to start by doing this today is by looking at contemporary works in moral and political philosophy, and in a sense to pay a different debt. And that's a debt about my intuitions, which I believe many of us share. My intuition is that a severely unequal or hierarchical society is objectionable. It's unjust. It's unfair to the people at the bottom. There's no good reason that another person should have 300, 400 times the income of the average worker, that there's a level of inequality that seems almost intrinsically objectionable. And that's my intuition. Can I defend that intuition? In a sense, that's the jumping off point for this whole course, rising inequality, exclamation mark, as if this is obviously something that should alarm us. Why is it that so many of us think of ourselves as egalitarians or are distressed by growing inequality? And the way I want to try to ground my intuition about inequality, to say it's not just something I believe, it's something that there seems to be a very good argument for. it's a conviction that we can defend, is by turning to moral and political philosophy. And I'm going to do that by looking at two recent works by two of the most eminent political and moral philosophers alive today. And I'm going to start with the work of a philosopher named Jeremy Waldron. And this is Jeremy Waldron here. He is from New Zealand, but he spent most of his life in England and the United States. In England, he did graduate work at Oxford University. In the United States, he was a professor at UC Berkeley, and then at Columbia, and now at NYU. In England, he also was a professor at Oxford, and not just any professor, he was the Chichely Professor of Political Philosophy, which most people regard to be the most esteemed position in the English-speaking world in moral and political philosophy, that it goes to the most influential person. The interesting story with Jeremy Waldron, and I'll come back to the theme here in a moment. Jeremy Waldron had lived in Berkeley for, I think, the better part of 20 years. And he was in a very enviable position. He was teaching jointly at the law school and in the philosophy department. And I should point out to you that he is a lawyer. He has an undergraduate law degree, and in New Zealand, that's the way it works. The law degree is an undergraduate degree, and he is deeply steeped in the law, both Commonwealth and positive law both the common law and the positive law of most of the Anglo countries, of New Zealand, of England, of the United States. And he's very well regarded as a legal theorist. But he is also a moral and political philosopher. What I was starting to tell you is that after around 20 years in Berkeley, he moved to Columbia and then NYU. At NYU, he was jointly appointed and is still jointly appointed in the law school and the philosophy department. And he then got the position in Oxford, this incredibly esteemed position. And he went and found that he missed his church community in Southern Manhattan. He's an Anglican, and that he, in the end, returned to New York, my understanding is, because of the religious community that he missed there. And I point this out in part because, as you can see, I've given you 3 of the roughly 10 books that Waldron has written, and the 3 that I'm looking at are all related to each other. The first one came out about a decade ago, and it's called God, Locke, and Equality. And in it, he makes the argument that John Locke, who in many ways is the founder of modern constitutional law, made a very powerful argument for human equality in his 2 treatises on government. And that Locke, in particular, did not dispense with, in the way that many subsequent liberals have, a religious argument that said part of the reason we're equal is because we are all God's children, all created in God's likeness, that God does not discriminate between us, and so we should not discriminate between each other, right? And Waldron, who is deeply religious, was interested in the question of whether or not we lost something when we removed the religious support for our egalitarianism. And he didn't conclude that we, here and now in the 21st century, necessarily lose something, but he did conclude that if John Locke had dispensed with the religious argument in the 17th century when he was writing, he would have lost a lot, because on the one hand, his audience was so deeply religious, and on the other hand, egalitarianism, the postulate that all humans are equal, that all men are created equal, which is an idea that Jefferson basically borrowed from Locke, that idea was so controversial in his historical moment that the only way to make the argument for it was by bolstering it with religious evidence. Now, in a more recent publication, Dignity, Ranks, and Rights, Waldron made the argument that all human beings are deserving of treatment as equally dignified, and we'll get into that argument in a minute, and that this is part of the reason that we believe all human beings have equal rights. And then in this most recent book, One Another's Equals, and this is the book that I'm going to concentrate on with you today, he really seeks to flesh out the basis of human equality. So for roughly a decade now, Waldron has been, among other things, strongly committed to this project of demonstrating the equality of all human beings, not just as an intuition or a supposition, but as an argument that can be sustained rigorously philosophically. All right, so having said that, let me give you then a little bit of Waldron's argument. And I want to start with the basic background here. What Waldron suggests is that basic equality, as opposed to surface level equality, refers to the idea that all human beings have a fundamental standing and dignity that means that they deserve equal treatment, equal concern, equal respect. And that's opposed to surface level equality, which would be to refer to how tall or short somebody is, how good looking they are, how smart they are, how well they sing or dance or play softball. And right, part of the thing that is worthwhile noting here is that obviously at a surface level, we are all different from each other, right? There is manifold diversity in human society. And that's just part of human nature. We're not all equal, nor will we ever be all equal in height or looks or ability to sing. And we shouldn't want a world like that. In fact, human diversity is a positive value, a benefit to all of us, and we should want to maintain it. But having said that, it's not the same as basic equality. And so we need to differentiate the idea that we have different appearances and different talents and different qualities from the idea that we should treat each other differently on that basis. Yes, if I want somebody to sing at my wedding, I want the person who sings well. That makes sense. But that doesn't mean that there's a good reason to afford that person different rights or a different level of dignity or a different standing in human society. And so this gets then down to the second distinction here between treatment as equals, which can be fleshed out using the vocabulary of Ronald Dworkin, as equal concern and respect, right? That when we treat somebody as an equal, we show them equal concern and respect, the same kind of concern and respect that we would show every other human being in light of their being a human being and in light of their having an equal dignity. And that doesn't mean that we treat everyone equally, right? Which it would be to say, for instance, if you're in a wheelchair, it's not treating you with equal concern and respect to say the stairs are over there, right? Everybody else takes the stairs, why shouldn't you? Obviously, we need to find ways for people who have a physical disability or some other limitation to make the world accessible and available to them. And frankly, we don't go far enough in that, as I'm sure many of you appreciate. And so treating people with equal concern and respect sometimes means treating them differently, not treating them the same. And again, that's just a basic distinction we need to get right when we think about the philosophy here. Next issue, the third issue, item C here, is that complex attention to equal interests often requires not paying too much attention to surface inequalities. And so the example that Waldron uses is the fire brigade example. He says, look, we need to have a fire department. We need to have people who will rescue us from burning buildings and put out fires and assist us in automobile accidents, etc. Should we assign the positions on the fire brigade by lottery so that everybody who wants to be a fire person has an equal chance of becoming a fire person? And he says, obviously there's a problem with that, which is if physical strength and agility and bravery are part of the prerequisites for doing this well, then if we just assign it by lottery and we end up with people who don't have the required skills, talents, capacity, disposition to do the job, then we're actually not doing what we want a fire department to do, which is to be able to rescue us when we're in distress, when we're on a high floor of a building that's on fire. And so actually equal concern and respect for all people requires that we have the right kind of person in the fire brigade, the person who is strong and brave and keeps a cool and collected head when in a dangerous situation. And similarly, we don't want everyone to be a surgeon. We don't want everyone to be a nurse. We don't want everyone to be a cook. We want the people who do those things well to do those things, not only because we want better surgeons, but because in a sense, equal concern for all persons dictates that we should have people who do their jobs well so as to be able to provide the services that we all need and want. So again, we've got to be careful in parsing what equality means and getting it right. That equality, in fact, means often getting the right person for the right job and not just having a lottery so that anybody who wants to do anything can do it. So this leads Waldron then to focus on basic equality, on this idea that every person deserves equal concern and respect because we are all equally dignified. And his suggestion is that we need to focus here now. And this book that I'm referring you to was given as lectures at Cambridge University 2 years ago. So it's quite current. We need to focus now on the one hand, because in a sense, for too long, philosophy has taken this foundational premise, right? This is the place so much moral, political, legal philosophy jumps off from. Ronald Dworkin, who I'm referring to a little bit, and so I'll show you. Dworkin is in many ways the most influential contemporary legal philosopher. He died about 5 years ago and really dominated the legal philosophy from the 1970s to the present. This is his book, Sovereign Virtue, The Theory and Practice of Equality. And so this is one of the works that Dworkin wrote on equality. And one of the ways in which Dworkin referred to our contemporary society is as resting on an egalitarian plateau. We all believe that all human beings are equal. Let's hope that's true. Maybe not all of us, but nearly all of us. And certainly most moral and political philosophy worth its salt, written since the middle of the 20th century, has inhabited that egalitarian plateau. But can we say why we believe everyone is equal? And in a sense, Waldron suggests we haven't spent enough time defending that core premise, that single claim. And so Waldron wants to do that. But he also points out, in the way that we've been surveying in this course up to now, we live in an increasingly unequal world. And when we see more and more social inequality, economic inequality around us, we begin to question whether or not really we are all equal. The stuff that we talked about over the last couple of weeks, in which in a more unequal society, people will deliberately do things to accentuate their inequality in order to differentiate themselves, to mark their status and their standing, and to preserve their privilege, both for themselves and for future generations. All of that, in a sense, suggests, well, if you went to the Ivy League college, you must be a better sort of person than the person who dropped out of high school. And that, Waldron suggests, makes it all the more imperative. The fact that we've become more unequal, and that when we live in a more unequal society, in a sense, the evidence all around us challenges the idea of basic human equality. That makes it all the more imperative that we have good arguments for fundamental equality available to us. Finally, in favor of this project, Waldron notes that there's been a long history of what he calls sortal statuses in law and politics. And I just want to point out to you that that means simply that we sort humanity. And you can think of feudal law here, which was committed to the idea that a serf or a peon is a fundamentally different kind of person, deserving of fundamentally different and fewer rights than a member of the nobility or aristocracy. And that for much of human history, we have sorted humanity, men from women, peasants from nobles, and more recently by race as well as by caste into different groups. And he points to Reverend Hastings Rashtel, who actually was the person who occupied the chair that Waldron occupied at Oxford at the beginning of the 20th century, who suggested essentially that white Europeans were a different sort of human being than were Africans and Asians, right? This is a professor of moral and political philosophy and a minister in the Anglican Church at the beginning of the 20th century. And so Waldron says, just so you don't think that this is something in the distant past, we need to pay attention to the fact that there have been people quite recently, quite esteemed, quite accomplished, who continued to believe in fundamental differences in humankind that were essentially like the difference between humans and animals. That's what a sortal difference is. That, right, there's such a difference between different kinds of human beings that we can treat some human beings more akin to animals. And of course, I don't need to point out to you that for the majority of American history, we practiced chattel slavery, treated fellow human beings, African Americans, as if they could be bought and sold and treated as property in the same way as farm animals. And that in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1930s and the 1940s, Hitler's genocidal Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews on the supposition that Jews were an inferior order of humanity, right? And so this is something that it is extremely important to be able to counter and to be able to suggest that there aren't these kinds of discontinuities between human beings. That is Waldron's fundamental project in this work, and I think it's an important and admirable project. This is where Waldron starts his work then, with this intuition or supposition, Dignity, as he puts it, I believe, is best understood as a status term. It refers to the standing of human beings in the great scheme of things, their status as persons who command a high level of concern and respect. The basis of our equal dignity as human is supposed to be something fundamental about us that makes it important for us to accord equal moral consideration to one another and to respect each other in the same way. And so if I can highlight for just a moment, this idea that there is supposed to be something fundamental about us that makes it important for us to accord equal moral consideration to each other, right? That's what Waldron is in search of. What is that thing about us that makes every human being command dignity? And so that's what gets his project really going. And I'm now going to get a little bit more detailed, a little bit more technical with you for a moment and talk with you about the way in which Waldron defends the idea that there is a fundamental basis, or maybe are fundamental bases, for human equality. So he starts by talking about the prescriptivity of equality. And I'm sorry, obviously my spell check didn't like the word because it's a piece of jargon. But what that means is it's a value that prescribes for us. Some values, the value of a delicious meal, the value of an appealing piece of art or vista from a mountain, may be attractive, but they're not prescriptive. That is to say, there's nothing that says you absolutely have to climb that mountain to get that vista. If you like the idea of admiring the view from the mountain, by all means, go climb the mountain. If you don't, it doesn't make you morally deficient that you did it. But a commanding value essentially says, no, you have to pay attention to this value. You have to actually act on its basis if you are a moral being. And that is what Waldron believes equality is, that you are subject to moral criticism and reproach if you fail to acknowledge human equality and to act on its basis in your life. And so that's what we're trying to get to, is a ground for that prescriptivity, a way of understanding why it is incumbent upon all of us that we recognize and act on equality as a fundamental value. And his suggestion is that we need to ground prescriptive principles in facts. We need to be able to refer back to something in our nature that makes us equal, right? And he differentiates target descriptions from descriptive characteristics, where target descriptions are, if you will, aspirations. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution says that all people are entitled to equal treatment under the law, right? And at the time that the 14th Amendment is passed, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, that's a target. That's an aspiration. That's something that we're aiming for, although we treat it as a description, right? All people are entitled to equal treatment under the law. As opposed to that, there are what Waldron refers to as descriptive characteristics. And descriptive characteristics refer to attributes of persons that all persons, or almost all persons, actually have. And this is where Waldron wants to focus. And in particular, he wants to focus on what he calls range properties. And so let me take a couple of examples of range properties to make it clear what we're talking about. A range property is a property that is not equally present in all human beings. That's what we refer to as the range. And so if we say, for instance, that all human beings deserve equal concern and respect because all human beings are equally capable of feeling affection for one another? Well, we certainly know that some people are what we might call empaths, right? They're highly empathic, and they walk into a room and they immediately notice if somebody's upset. And it might be that the person's wife or husband didn't really know what was bothering them, but the person who's highly empathic immediately picks up on something, right? And so that person is on one end of the range, the most sensitive end of the range. And there might be somebody else in the room who basically just doesn't get it a lot of the time, isn't very sensitive, isn't very high in the what's called emotional intelligence scale. But nevertheless, they have a life partner, and they would be heartbroken if that person left them or deceased, right? And so even though they have much less capacity for affection and emotional intelligence, they have it to a sufficient degree that you can't treat them like a robot or a tree, right? And so that's a range property, something that once you get over the minimum threshold, we have to recognize that it qualifies you for a certain kind of treatment. You're no longer a rock. You have affection for your mother and your father and your children and your spouse. And that means that you can be hurt in ways that a rock can't be hurt, right? That somebody who has, or something that has no affection can't be hurt. Another example would be the capacity for reason. And clearly, there are those of us who are smarter, and smarter in different respects. Those of us who are really good at math or at science, those of us who are really good musically, those of us who are not so good at math and science, but can really figure out what's going on in a novel, or can unpack a legal argument in great detail, right? And on the other hand, there's some of us who don't really have any of those capabilities, but we still have the capacity to think for ourselves. And we'll get a little bit more into this in a moment, but what we can recognize again is just in the same way that a rock can't be hurt by taking away other rocks from it, and so we don't care about hurting a rock's feelings, but a person who has affection can be hurt even if they're not an emotional genius or an empath. Similarly, if you treat someone as if they can't think for themselves, as if they're just a piece of furniture to be moved around, or an imbecile to be told what to do, you show a lack of respect for that person, even if they're not a genius, right? And so you need to, at least if you think they're not reasoning carefully, explain to them, right? Treat them as someone who thinks for themselves and ultimately needs to be convinced, as opposed to something that does not have the capacity for thought. Again, a range, right? There are people who think really, really well about some things, and people who don't think very well at all about them. But as long as they have the capacity, fall within that range, you have to show them equal concern and respect, even though they don't have the capacity to the same or equal degree. And so part of what Waldron suggests is that it's range properties that we need to be paying attention to, and that this allows us to notice human diversity, respect it, acknowledge it, take it into account at the same time that we also find a ground for human equality. So then to go to some of the specific range properties, and what Waldron does is really give us kind of a list, an account of all the candidates to be range properties. We've already talked about one of them, actually two of them, the capacity to feel affection for others. And so if you are a human being, Waldron suggests, with very rare exceptions, people who perhaps have some personality disorder, we feel affection for other people, right? And that humanizes us. That creates in us a need for human connection. And that is part of what leads us then to believe that all persons deserve concern and respect, is because we can be damaged if you treat someone with indifference or disdain, right? They have a basic need to feel affection. They can also be damaged if you violate their rights, if you don't let them marry, if you take their children away, if you cut them off from their parents, right? These are among the things that equal rights protect, is the need to have circumstances that allow for affection to do its work. Similarly with the capacity for reason. And here I'm not going to go into all the details, but Waldron suggests there are multiple accounts of how the capacity for reason works. There's a Stoic and Christian theological account that the capacity for reason, among other things, lets us understand God's law and our place in a created universe. There's a tradition within the common law that says what reason allows you to do, among other things, is to think of yourself as a person with aims and ends that give you your identity. And the connection between reason and the capacity for personhood is, again, part of what rights protect. Rights protect the core exercise of reason in identifying yourself and creating your plan for life, in determining which ends you're going to pursue in your life. Another example of our capacity for reason, and if you think about it for a moment, it's quite a phenomenal capacity, is language, right? Almost every human being, again, with the absence of extreme injuries or defects, has the capacity to form grammatically structured sequences of words, utterances that convey our intentions, our desires, our interests, that allow us to communicate and coordinate with each other. And again, this is a capacity that isn't just a neutral capacity. It's not as if it just allows me to say things. I'm not just a utterance generating machine. It allows us to formulate our plans, to express our interests and desires and affections to each other. And so the fact that we exist in and through language in ourselves and with each other is a fundamental expression of our reason, of our capacity for self-direction. And that gets us then to practical reason, which is the compartment or subdivision of reason that allows us to lead our lives from within, to decide, you know, I've got this person interested in marrying me, but I'm really not that interested in them. I don't think I want to spend my life with them, right? And the alternative might be that I'll never marry. And that's okay. There are other things that I can do. Or I'm going to be patient and wait for the right person to come along. Yes, I do want to be married, but not to that person, right? And so that's a capacity to direct your own life according to your own lights, your own ends, your interests as you understand them. Practical reason isn't just about understanding the world around you. It's about determining what you're going to do with your life. And again, if every human being has a sufficient share of practical reason for all of us to be able to order our lives as we see fit, then that marks human beings as being special, as being different from rocks and squirrels and chimps and dogs, right? And Waldron doesn't necessarily say we have to differentiate humans from animals, but we certainly recognize differences between humans and animals, and that gives humans certain rights that we don't typically afford to animals, rooted, among other things, in our possession of practical reason. Now, Immanuel Kant, who's one of Waldron's heroes, and who I'm going to focus on for a minute, in a minute, is committed to the idea that it's in particular moral reasoning, the capacity not just to decide who you want to marry, but what is right and wrong. What do you owe to other people? How should you treat them? That fundamentally marks you as a dignified human being capable of governing yourself according to your own reason, and hence having personal autonomy, right? Where the literal meaning of autonomy, autonomos in Greek, is being able to make your own rules, laws, and conventions for yourself, right? To figure out right from wrong and to guide yourself. And Waldron then finally focuses on one more example, and this is the contemporary philosopher John Rawls, another luminary in contemporary political philosophy. I'll just point to his book, Justice is Fairness, one of a half dozen seminal works that Rawls published in his lifetime from the 1970s until the early 2000s. Rawls says, well, maybe there's a composite here, that each of us has a sense of justice, a sense of rightness, a sense of fairness. And that's extremely important in accounting for our moral reasoning and autonomy. But also each of us has a capacity for the good, a sense of what makes life worth living for each of us, what makes it meaningful. And those two are different and distinct, but each of us has them to a sufficient degree that we all should be treated as equals. And we need to respect then each person's capacity to, first of all, figure out what justice, rightness, fairness means to them. And second of all, to figure out what is good for them, what they values and ends and purposes they want to realize in their life. Now, Waldron concludes his discussion by asking whether or not the case would be strengthened by theological grounding, in the way that he had demonstrated it was for Locke in his earlier work. And I want to say that he does tentatively suggest that for people who do have religious belief, theological grounding strengthens the case, which is to say that God equipped us with these capacities because he made us in his image, and that these capacities then are not just accidental byproducts of evolution, but intentionally implanted in us to realize some value, right? And that would strengthen the case, but Waldron also notices, and I think this is important, that perhaps unlike Locke's time, we can no longer take for granted that everybody finds the theological grounding to be convincing. And so the theological case can reinforce the secular or philosophical case, but no longer is necessary to it. Now, as I said, I want to return to Kant for just a minute. And I'm sorry, I know this is involved, but let me point out to you that the central formulation in Kant's moral philosophy of the basis for equality that I think most influences Waldron's work. This is from a work called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, one of Kant's most widely read works in moral and political philosophy. And Kant suggests in this work that there are categorical imperatives, basic moral laws that all people must follow to be moral. And one formulation of the categorical imperative for Kant is act so that your will could regard itself as giving universal laws through all its maxims. So when you do something, you need to test it to be sure that it's moral, particularly when you do something that affects somebody else. And one way to do that would be to ask, could this be agreed to as a universal law? And here's what Kant says in defending this position. The practical necessity of acting in accordance with this principle, that is, duty, does not rest at all on feelings, impulses, and inclinations, but merely on the relation of rational beings to one another, in which the will of a rational being must always be regarded as at the same time law-giving, since otherwise it could not be thought as an end in itself. And so just for a moment, right, Kant is here suggesting this is not just a feeling or an inclination, right? We may have an intuition that all people are equal, but we need to be able to offer a reason. And one way to think about this is the fact that each of us has the experience of using our own will to govern ourselves. And we recognize that as moments in which we're making significant decisions, often proud of ourselves for our ability to step back and say, wait a sec, what should I do? Kant continues, reason accordingly refers every maxim of the will as giving universal law to every other will and also to every action toward oneself, and does so not for the sake of any other practical motive or any future advantage, but from the idea of the dignity of a rational being who obeys no law other than that which he himself at the same time gives. Now, this is difficult, I know, and I'm feeling badly that I'm sharing with you a text that typically in my classes we might spend weeks building up to this to really be able to understand this. But I want you to be able to understand the basic idea here, which is that every person has this experience of following their own will, and at the same time also has perhaps the experience of having somebody else just command them, tell them what to do, not care that they be convinced that it's the right thing to do, to be in a sense helpless to direct their own fate as opposed to directing their own fate. And that this is a fundamental difference in experience. And what you do when you direct yourself is to act as a dignified and rational being. And what you experience when somebody commands you, orders you, doesn't care what you think, but just tells you to do it, is in a sense an experience of your dignity being violated. And that the fundamental ground for equality for Kant is this experience that we all have of the capacity to order our own lives using our own reason, and that we need to ask for others to respect this, but also respect this in other people, right? So he continues, in the kingdom of ends, everything has a price or a dignity. What has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. What, on the other hand, is raised above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. And so again, right, Kant is suggesting, well, when it comes to rocks or animals or furniture, you can buy it and then you own it, and then you can do with it what you want, including trading it for something else. But when it comes to human beings, they're not that kind of object. They have dignity, not price, because they have the capacity to order their lives using their reason. And I'll conclude with one more quote from Kant. This is from the Critique of Practical Reason, right? The work that the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals precedes. And here Kant in the conclusion says the following: two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and steadily one reflects on them: the starry heavens above and the moral law within me. I do not need to search for them and merely conjecture them as though they were veiled in obscurity or in the transcendent region beyond my horizon. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my existence. And so why I think this is important, and I want to conclude here today, is that Kant thinks that you can discern, reason working within yourself, the capacity of you as a reasoning being to govern yourself morally and practically. And that as a result, the basis for thinking that all human beings are equal and deserving of equal concern and respect, of being treated as equally dignified, is right there inside of you if you're willing to look. You don't have to have a degree in philosophy, a deep theological conviction, some moral epiphany. If you look into yourself, into what it feels like when you feel outraged and disrespected and why that is, or alternatively, what it feels like when you do a good job making a decision, stick by your guns, use your will to govern your appetites, you have a strong sense of what it is that you need to respect in others, yes, in order to treat them as equals, and why that's so important. If others disregard it in you, you feel not just disregarded, but injured, that there's a moral injury in their failure to take you seriously. And just as you never want that to happen to you, you should never want to do that to anyone else. And so the basis for thinking all people are equal is available to us upon introspection. All right, I'll stop there. I know today was a little bit technical. Please let me know what questions, comments, thoughts you have. Let me unmute you. Everybody is now unmuted. Lois, go ahead. Lois, I think you need to unmute yourself by pushing your spacebar. Lois, I'm having trouble hearing you. It says you're unmuted, but I think, can you press and hold your spacebar? Now try talking. I'm still not hearing you. I'm sorry. Give me a second.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Myself.
Yes, now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just unmuted myself.
Good.
I feel it's not Friday when I go to religious services, but when I go to religious services, I expect to feel like I feel now after listening to this lecture. I feel like it's it's what religion is all about and what it does for me when I listen to it. I don't know how else to explain it, but it's like, this is what religion is all about. This is why we are what we are. And it means a great deal to me to be able to try to understand more of what you're talking about. I really appreciate this kind of an experience today.
Well, thank you for that comment, Lois. And let me say that what is important to me about moral and political philosophy, why I went into this field, is that it gets at some of the deepest and most significant truths about humanity. And I think in a sense it shares that with religion. These are different ways of trying to understand what makes life worth living, what we owe to each other, what humanizes us. And so thank you for the comment, Lois. I do appreciate it. And I'm glad to hear that's the way you're receiving it. I worried a little bit that it might be too technical when I was talking with you about today. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Could you hear me?
Yes, I can. Who is this?
Okay, it's Anne.
Hi, Anne.
Hi. I just listening to you, I say to myself, how lucky I am that I had the parents that I had that taught me all this humanity. And I feel sorry for people that don't have that background.
Yeah, nice comment, Anne. And so let me tell you something I've been thinking about a little bit. And I know not so much from my mom, but from my great aunt, my mom's mother's sister, that my mom's parents were not very good to my mom, that they were distant and critical and difficult. And my mom moved far away from them and became a very different kind of parent. And so I too feel very grateful, especially to my mom for having, I think, instilled good values in me, but also just having supported me with, as we say, unconditional love, with given me the courage to do what I wanted to do in my life, and the support throughout. And so I especially appreciate her for having said, I'm not going to be the kind of parent my parents were to me. I'm going to be a different kind of parent, that I don't want to perpetuate what happened to me, but I want to break from it. And so, yes, I sometimes these insights come rather late in life, but yes, I too am grateful for having the kind of parents I have, and maybe that can help us as well to humanize those who we may not have a lot of sympathy for, right? When we were looking at the data before on Republican attitudes about race, and we might be very critical of those attitudes, but maybe we should also think, maybe it's not just about me being enlightened and them not being enlightened. Maybe it's about the good fortune I had to have the kind of mother I had who helped me to see the humanity in other people, even if they don't share the same race that I have. And that's not something I can take full responsibility for. And then also, maybe I can't be quite so critical of those people who are not where I am on this issue. And not that I want them to be in charge or making the law, but that I need to figure out ways of reaching them with respect while trying to indicate to them the limits of their beliefs. Thank you. Anyone else with a question or a comment at this point? Oh, Stanley, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think you partly answered my question, but like there are a lot of people who believe that, say, wearing masks is pointless, that it doesn't help, and they go out in public and they come in close contact and they won't wear a mask. What does Kant say? Should you respect them? Do they really have a right to exert their will in a case like that?
Oh, thank you, Stanley, and that's very helpful to clarify Kant a little bit. No, Kant would not say that you should respect the right of somebody to do something that endangers other people. Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that you don't respect them. And so there's a difference between respecting the person while condemning the act and condemning the person. right? And as a matter of fact, what Kant would say is that precisely because I respect the person, I have to hold them accountable for the act. They have free will, and they're using their free will to do something that endangers innocent people for no good reason, right? And so in a sense, Kant would say, you should probably go up to that person in the grocery store and say, excuse me, but you are endangering me and I need you to put your mask on. I actually did that to somebody in the grocery store the other day. I had my trepidations. I was concerned. I was thinking more about the people who worked at the store than me. And he looked kind of sheepishly and put his mask right on. So I got lucky. I picked on the right person, I guess. But that's what I think Kant would tell us to do.
But many of those people believe that the mask is useless. The line that I heard was, do you put up a wire fence to keep the mosquitoes out?
Well, those people need to listen to Dr. Fauci. They need to listen to the medical science. And to be clear, I think the evidence is very ambivalent about whether or not the mask protects me from getting the virus if you have it. But if I have the virus, it protects you. And I think that's part of what's so sad about the current situation. I think if more people thought about it in that way, you're not protecting yourself, but you're preventing yourself from infecting other people. You may be perfectly healthy and think this virus poses no risk to you, but you can still be a vector of transmission to somebody who's immunocompromised or is going to have more difficulty fighting it. So yes, it's a bad analogy, right? The wire fence to protect from mosquitoes, right? The better example would be drain your pond if mosquitoes are breeding in it.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, Stanley, thank you. And I hope that clarifies. Kant is not an anarchist or a relativist. He thinks that we need to hold each other accountable for doing the right thing. Absolutely.
Okay.
Good. All right. Anybody else with a question at this point? All right, then I'm going to wish everybody a good afternoon. Thank you for coming along on the rough ride through philosophy with me.
Thank you.
Ahead. Okay. Oh, yes. Thanks so much. Take care. Keep being safe and strong. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.